unparalleled security, know how to configure authentication and authorization. Now, if you recall, we've done a lot with this already, except for this time, we're going to work with what's called service accounts. So previously, we were doing essentially, we dealt with essentially user accounts or human accounts. And the distinction here is, if you recall, the user accounts, there was no mechanisms within Kubernetes to create accounts. All you really did was, there was an external processes for managing the authentication, and you'd come in with a username and group, right? And then you can assign, authorizations based on those. Here, with service accounts, we actually do create accounts in Kubernetes, and the principal reason is that, generally service accounts are tightly coupled to, not so much your HR organization, but to the apps themselves. So that's why you can do that with service accounts. Okay, so that's that. Let's look at, right out of the box, there's a couple of service accounts already created. And let's look at this, let's look at them real quick. Get to the command line. Kube control, get, describe. Let's just get it real quick. Oh. So I'm just getting this list of service accounts. So the first thing is service accounts are namespaced. Okay, that's the first observation. And another observation we'll see is that we have in our default namespace, we actually have a service account called default. So both are named default. So kube control or cuddle describe service account default. So there's not much to service accounts. Principal way to think about them is basically name and namespace. And one other thing that's important here is this tokens. So, whenever there's a service account, there's a backing kube control describe get secret. So there is a secret that also exists. I guess those are also namespaced, and you see that these are tied together. And in that control, just describe secret default. So secret consists of three things essentially. One is there's a token, which we'll look at in a minute. There's a namespace and a CA cert. Okay. And we'll look at how all these come, how are being used. So again, the key here is when you create a service account, there's also a token created automatically, one of these secrets that looks just like that one. Okay. So now the question is, what are these tokens? And I think we're going to see if I can get this to work. I'm going to walk through an example of using a token, right? So we're talking about this token right here. So what we're going to do here is these tokens are basically can be used when you make API calls against the Kubernetes API server, right? And when you do that, you're basically authenticating as that user against it, right? And then all the authorization rules that all the roles and stuff like that, and the bindings, those come into play with the authorization against that authenticated credential, right? So what I'm going to do, just to illustrate this, we're going to try to use this token to authenticate against the API server and just validate that, that ties it back to this service account. So let's just go through it by example. Okay, so first thing I want to do is there's the token, but I actually need a couple things here. To make an API call, I want to call curl, but I need to know what the endpoint is. So, something, I did this earlier. So, okay, so I'm going to show you what all the pieces are, and then I'm going to cheat. And so first thing I'm going to do is cat /cube.cube config. Okay, so if you're using kubectl, there's a config file, and then you'll see in here there is, right, there's an endpoint. That's what I'm looking for. Here's an endpoint right here. Server is right here, right? So I get a copy of that, right? The token I just saw was in the token I can get from describing that secret, right? So there's that secret. I copy that, right? And then I'm going to run, first, okay, I'm going to do a couple things. History, grep curl. History, grep curl. Hopefully I have all these in my memory, otherwise I'm going to have to do some. Oh, I don't have them. Darn it. Wait, I do have them. Okay, so what the first I'm going to do is I'm going to curl, you run 1950. 1750. So that should be, okay, I'm just curling this one, just the address, right? And the first thing it says, hey, there's an SSL certificate problem, right? So to fix that, you could just tack on a -- insecure. That'll at least get past the certificate problem. And you can see that it says forbidden user anonymous. Basically, it doesn't know who you are, right? Now, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do history, and I'm going to do, grep curl. So I'm going to paste it in. We'll look at it. 1762. Right. Okay. So here I did curl insecure, but I'm passing a header. This authorization. This is a common pattern. This is called a bearer token. So you say bearer, and then this was the token I got out of that secret, right? That was the secret tied to that system account, right? And when I do that, it comes back. I'm still not authorized, right? But now it knows who the user is. It actually says, hey, the user is system service account default. So this is system service account. This is the namespace. And then this is the name. So this basically says this user is not authorized. But the point is, the important point here is that it actually knows who the user is now. And in this case, that user is a system service account. Okay? So the whole point of that was to illustrate that is how these tokens, essentially, this is the pattern. We're going to be able to use these service accounts to make authenticated API calls to API server using that token that's associated with the account. Now, the first thing you'll notice here is whenever these default, like that default account, by default, any new service account that gets created has no authorization, right? I mean, you can authenticate, but you have no access to anything. That's the first observation. So that's up to you then, once you create these service accounts, is to grant them access using these role bindings, either a cluster role binding or a role binding. Okay, so that's sort of the main point there. Now, what happens? Let's do an example. If I create another namespace, what happens? So let's try this. If I do kubectl create namespace. Test, I think I said here. Yeah, test. So I create a new namespace, kubectl, right? Get service accounts. First thing you'll notice is that, this is namespace. So in that namespace, in addition to getting a namespace, it actually also creates automatically a service account, right? And that service account has an associated secret. Okay, so that's another quick observation. Basically every namespace automatically has a default service account, which has an associated secret, which gives you that token. Okay, I think that's it for this. Oh, and what we'll do, okay, so let me delete that service account. I guess the next step of this is kubectl delete namespace test. So I guess it's may not be clear, but whenever you delete a namespace, it's going to also delete the secret and delete the service account too, just so you know. Because I can't even do it because there's no namespace test, so I can't even look up anything in that namespace because the namespace doesn't exist. Okay, so that's automatically happens. Okay, now the next thing I'm going to do is talk about how do service accounts relate to pods, right? So we've just been talking about service accounts and these tokens, but we're not really talking about how they relate to pods and what are these tokens used at. I just used an example using that token from my own command line, right? So let's go ahead and install a pod real quick. So this is just a regular pod. I guess I'll just, for completeness, I'll look at it, but it's basically nothing special in this pod. Okay, this pod is basically, okay, give me a second, I'm going to pause the video for a second. Of course, I got distracted and I forgot where I was at. I think we were just getting ready to deploy this pod. So if I do helm install dev pod, I want to illustrate a couple things. So I guess one thing in general, you notice that when I created this pod, there was no mention of a service account. We've never even heard of the term until just now. But under the hood, pod, let's describe that pod real quick. In here, it's not in this one. Okay, so I have to get the pod. Okay, so if I get the details of the pod, you will notice that automatically in the spec, it supplies default. Default is default. So the service account name is set to default, which is essentially the same as a service account, right? So the point is that every pod, whether you supply one or not, is associated with a service account, and by default, a pod gets tied to the default service account in the same namespace. Okay, so and so that's what we talked about earlier when we talked about a pod being authenticated to a service account. It's basically that entry, right? Now, the question is, well, what does that mean to be authenticated to? I see an entry in the configuration here, right? Okay, give me a second, or I'm going to pause it again. Okay, so get back to business here. So we had just noticed that these pods are associated with the service account, but then the question is, what does that really mean? And actually what it means, if you look carefully at, let me describe it, you will notice that, if I can find it, what am I looking for? Hand. Oh, here it is, right here. Right here. You notice that now, if you look at that pod, I didn't create any volumes, right? But here it is, all of a sudden I have a volume, right? And it's in here basically it's a secret, and it's mapping to that token, right? As a matter of fact, if I describe, let me get the code in detail, I should be able to see, where is the config? Oh, here, this is what I was looking for. Okay, so you notice now, you notice here that the volume, just by creating a pod, right, that's tied to a service account, it automatically maps the associated secret, right, to a folder called var run secrets Kubernetes IO service account, right? And which means now inside of the container, we should be able to see that folder. So let's go ahead and look at that. And then just observe it real quick. So copy this. So if I do dev bash cd paste, you will notice now cat token. So there's my token, and there's the namespace, which is default, right? And then there's a CA cert. Okay, give me a second. I gotta pause the video again. All right, so the whole thing we just did here was just noticing that by having a service account associated with this, we actually have access to the token, the CA cert, and if you recall, we used that CA cert earlier if we needed to make HTTP requests to various internal to the cluster, right? All the certificates are signed by the CA cert, right? And namespace is just kind of convenient to have, you know which namespace you're in. Okay, so I think the whole point of this exercise was to show you that when you say a pod is authenticated to a service account, basically means that it gets a mapped volume to a secret that has the token, the CA cert, and the namespace. And that's it. Okay, so let me get out of this. Okay, so now what we're going to do is we're going to look at a complete example of a service account where I'm going to illustrate kind of the whole flow of how you might use a service account with a pod. So let me first helm uninstall dev. Let's look at the service account folder here. So pod service account templates. Okay, so the first thing you'll notice is that here I'm going to create a service account. So service account is just basically a name, right? And I have the labels like usual. So that's and it's in a namespace. By default, it's default. So that's all you really need to do to create a service account. Okay, but I want to give, as we saw earlier, just having a service account doesn't give it any authorization, so you can't do anything with the service account. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to bind, and this is just like we did before, I'm going to take that service account and I'm going to bind it using a role binding, right? And which basically means that this because it's a role binding, not a cluster role binding, means that this is tied to only resources within the namespace, right? And I'm binding it to a cluster role called view, right? So this service account is being tied to a cluster role called view, which is one of the built-in cluster roles that gives you read-only access to pretty much everything. So because it's a role binding, essentially, now this service account has read-only access to everything in that namespace, but not in other namespaces. Okay, so that's what that role binding is doing for me. And then, of course, the pod, I'm creating a pod, but this time I'm explicitly telling it what service account name I'm using. And that means now this pod should be authenticated to this service account, which then, in theory, if I use those tokens right, I should be able to hit the API and do read-only operations on that namespace. Whew. Okay, so let's create this and go through the exercise of using those credentials. So I'm going to go in here. I'm going to do helm install dev service account. Okay, and then I'm going to log into the dev. Okay, and so now I'm sitting on the apt-get install curl. No, update. I'm going to use curl, so I need to get curl real quick. Apt-get install. Okay, so we've got curl. Now I'm going to paste a command in here, and then we're going to decipher it here. It's fairly lengthy. Okay, so I'm ready to go. I'm going to paste this in. Oh. What's wrong here? Let's see, I'm on dev. Var. Hang on a second. Okay, this should have worked, so I'm confused. Let me troubleshoot for a second on video, and then I'll go off video. So ls var run secrets Kubernetes service account. Right, those files are there. Okay, let me troubleshoot for this a minute. The files look like they're there, but it's complaining about it. Give me a second. I'm back. I had a typo. I just fixed it in the doc, so it'll be correct now. I had typed in, I missed the A in var, so I was trying to go to a folder called VR instead of var. Okay, so what does this command say? It says curl. I'm adding authorization header of type bearer, right? The value of that is I'm catting basically that in that secrets folder, right? The token that's in there. And for the CA cert, right, I'm using basically the C8 cert that's in that same folder. And then I'm hitting the Kubernetes service. So that Kubernetes default refers to the Kubernetes service, right? It's one of the services that's default available. And then I'm hitting one of the endpoints on there. And in this case, I'm listing the pods in the default namespace. Okay. Now, as a sidebar, on a video a long time ago, I actually, in that exercise, I actually manually created my own CA cert, like config map, trying to push that CA cert into the pods, not knowing at the time that it was already there, just under this folder. So that was just an interesting observation. So if I hit this, I basically get a list of the pods, and there's only one pod, and it's ironically enough, the pod is myself, right? Now, just for giggles, I will try to use a different namespace, and I should get an authorization problem, right? So if I try to go to a namespace, I don't know, cube system, if this works, I'll be surprised, right? So basically, this user cannot list resources in this namespace. That's because I only granted read access using a role binding, which means it's only limited to the namespace, in this case, default. Okay. So this the whole point of this exercise here was that you can now, this is a way that we can give access to processes inside of our pods to make calls to Kubernetes. And to be honest, this is not a pattern that, at least in my mind, was something that I would regularly do. Most of my applications I'm writing are all about writing to databases. I'm not normally thinking that I'm going to be making changes to the infrastructure. I think this tools like, features like this are more important for like system level code that you're running in a pod. Like we've seen a lot, all those pods that are running, doing DNS or whatever they're doing, right? That's probably more relevant for those kind of processes than maybe applications that are serving your business, right? These are more like utility applications that are somehow configuring your infrastructure. Okay, see if there's anything more here. Oh, there's one more thing. The files that are in the secret, right, that are in this folder, var run secrets, right? That secret there's a token rotation that happens on a regular cycle, and I don't have it on top of my head how frequently it is. It's at least once every 24 hours. Okay, and what that means is when you have your processes, you can't just read that token once and then forget about it. You're going to have to read it on some cycle, and the docs do suggest that just to play it safe, you should, if you're going to cache that token, you should keep it for no longer than 5 minutes, and that way you always know that you have the right token when you make these API calls. So that's the recommended. And that's because you basically, it's going to rotate the token if it's older than 80% of its TTL, right? So the idea is you want to make sure you always have a fresh token. And by checking every 5 minutes, you're always guaranteed to have a token that's going to be valid. Okay, now we're done with the video. Thank you.